In this video, you will learn about the elements of the rhetorical situation, which is probably the most important lesson in this course, at least as far as the actual AP language curriculum is concerned. And because of the way that this slideshow is operating, I'm going to give you all of the terms first. And then on the next slide, I'm going to give you an example, and I'm going to align specific examples to each of the terms. So bear with me for this part. Take notes, and then in the next part, you'll see examples that will illustrate the concepts. What you see in front of you is the rhetorical triangle, which is my preferred way of analyzing the rhetorical situation. It was initially developed by Aristotle way back when, sometime in BCE, before Common Era. So it's been around for a long time. And what I like about the triangle is that it doesn't just ask us to think about the terms, it asks us to think about the relationship among the points of the triangle, which the relationships are really the most important part. So that's why I love this visual, and I will be using it again and again and again. So really become comfortable drawing some triangles. The top of the triangle is the subject. What is the text about? And just a side note on text. When I talk about text, it's not just written. Really, anything that is communication can be considered text, whether it's visual, written, spoken, anything that's communication, we're going to talk about as a text. And when I ask, what is the text about? You always want to be as specific as you possibly can. So if we're reading a piece about how somebody was discriminated against, we're not going to say that the subject is discrimination. We're going to get as specific as we can to what is the nature of the discrimination in that particular example. On the bottom, I guess it's our right if we're looking at it, the bottom right of the triangle is the speaker. And again, the speaker is not just it's not just talking about like speaking out loud. We're talking really about the person who created the text, whether it's written, spoken, or visual. We're talking about that person as the speaker. So it's kind of an all-encompassing term. And when we talk about the speaker, again, it's not enough just to identify the person. We need to think about what are this person's beliefs and values as demonstrated by the text. When you're creating your own arguments, you're going to need to think about your own beliefs and values, which is, kind of why we started with that, because that's the core of all argument. An important word here with speaker is persona. So the word persona comes from, I believe it's Greek, for mask. So it's basically, how are you presenting yourself to your audience? What kind of person do you want to seem like to them? A lot of this has to do with establishing your credibility in the piece, especially if the audience doesn't know you well. And speaking of audience, with audience, we're really always talking about intended audience. What group of readers or listeners is the text directed toward? So while it is almost always true that a variety of people and types of people could have access to and could see the text, when we're talking about audience, we're thinking about who do I most want to move? What person or group of people am I targeting? And that's your intended audience. And anytime we talk about audience, that's really what I'm talking about. Who's your intended audience? I cannot overstate the importance of the question here in bold. What are their beliefs and values? It's kind of everything. It's not enough to identify and say, oh, the audience is high school students. Okay, well, what are their beliefs and values? And usually we need to think about that in relation to the subject, which we'll get to in a moment. Exigence is another really important term. You might see this in some readings that you'll come across as called the occasion. I actually don't like the word occasion because I think occasion suggests that it has to be a moment or an event. But exigence is really just what necessitates the act of communication. So it's the event or circumstance that motivates the writer or speaker to create the text. Like, why are they writing about this now? What is giving cause to that? And there needs to be an exigence. So this is a question that I'm going to ask you when you're writing. Well, what's your exigence? Why are you writing about this now? It can't just be, oh, I just thought of it and it's kind of random. It needs to be grounded in the present moment. Speaking of that, context. So context is all the surrounding. So if you look at the figure in the middle of the screen, that's the black, all the stuff that influences the other relationships. And sometimes it's historical. Sometimes it has more to do with an ongoing conversation. And depending on, what the subject, speaker, audience are, this could be as small and focused as the conversation in a family. It could be influenced by social or cultural circumstances. And all of this will make more sense when I give you an example. But context is really important because it influences everything else. All right, now let's take a look at the sides of the triangle, the relationships. The relationship between subject and speaker. Often it's, especially if it's a persuasive act, it's that the speaker wants the subject or the speaker wants the audience to do something in relation to the subject. So usually it's a positive relationship, sometimes one that has desire in some way. That's probably the least important side of the triangle because those are the starting points, right? The speaker wants something or wants the audience to think, do, or feel something in relation to the subject. So the more important sides are the ones that have to do with the audience's relation to the subject and the speaker. In terms of the subject, this is really what you want to look at for beliefs and values. What is the relationship between the audience and the subject? So it's not just what are their beliefs in life, what are their values in life. That's important, but more important is their beliefs and values in relation to the subject, because that's actually all you really can know and think about. It's too overwhelming of a task to try to account for all the possible beliefs and values that an audience member might have. Just in general, you really want to focus in on, okay, how do they feel about the subject? What do they believe regarding the subject? What values do I need to pinpoint here? And that's what you're going to tap into when you go to create the text. And then finally, the relationship between the audience and the speaker. This could be, there's a huge range here, right? So if we're talking about a text where a child is trying to convince the parent of something, which is what we're going to see in my example, then there is a very close relationship, right? A personal relationship, even an intimate relationship. And there's a lot of history there. And in those cases, the speaker can kind of say whatever they want, but the audience knows the speaker so well that if the speaker is not being truthful about how they're presenting themselves, then that's going to actually damage their ethos. If the speaker is somebody that the audience has never met before or knows only on a superficial level, then it's going to be more important for the speaker to work on that persona because of how important trust is to the persuasive relationship. Okay, so those are your key terms. You need to memorize them. And you also need to then to be able to apply them. So let's look at an example rhetorical situation. So in the persuasive act, we are going to be looking at how my son Joshua would like for us, my husband and I, to get him a phone. At the time of this recording, my son is 9 and will be 10 in 3 or so months. He'll be 10 in March. And he'll be going to middle school next year because in our district, middle school starts in 5th grade. So the subject is getting a phone next year. That is the thing that he wants that his text is about. He, my son, believes he ought to get a phone next year because he'll be in middle school. And that's kind of as far as his reasoning goes. I'm going to be in middle school. I should have a phone. And part of this is because in middle school, he, for the first time, is going to have the chance to potentially stay after school. We're entertaining the possibility of him getting to school himself in the morning. We live within walking distance of the school. We also have universal busing. So in theory, at some point, he will be old enough and mature enough to get himself on the bus without us being home to get him on the bus. So these are some of the contextual elements. But for him, it's really about his friends. So he believes his friends will have one. He already has a few friends who have one, so he wants one too. And his values that are really high right now are his relationships with friends, of being accepted, of being able to interact with them and talk to them. And that's in many ways one of his most important values at the time. The audience is me and my husband, and we do value independence. We want Joshua to do more on his own. We would like to be able to trust him to get himself to school in the morning and to stay late for activities if that's what he wants to do. But, and this is a huge but, we also worry about too much screen time and unregulated internet access. We believe he's too young to have a smartphone. We would like for him to have a way to communicate that doesn't require him to have a phone that has internet and video games and all those things on it, because we don't think he is mature enough to self-regulate. So I've kind of covered some of the other elements already. So exigence, that he's starting middle school next year. And I've already talked about how he might need to stay after, get on the bus himself. He needs to be able to communicate with us, because he's not going to be with us all the time, and we're not going to be depending on the school to communicate when something happens and like we need to pick him up. So those are the circumstances that necessitate the communication here. The communication being that he is trying to convince us to get him a phone. The context, a few of his friends already have them, which increases the desire for him to have one and the pressure on both him and us to get him one. Again, we want him to be independent. That's part of the context of our family situation, but we don't trust him to self-regulate. And there's a lot of context that goes into that, which I'll get into more when we get to relationships. So here again, subject speaker. This is pretty straightforward. He's wanted a phone since he knew what a phone was. I believe he started asking for one when he was 5. Generally, my husband and I do not think children should have smartphones. And by children, I don't mean teenagers. I'm really, although even there, sometimes it's questionable. To some degree, I think age isn't, you can't really base it on age. You have to base it on the child's ability to self-regulate and to know and understand the boundaries. Joshua has difficulty with those boundaries. He has shown time and time again that he can't manage his own technology use. He has lied to us about how much time he spent on devices. There have been times when he's kind of snuck the devices up to his room and shut the door, locked the door. He's pretended to be doing one thing when he's really playing a video game. So he's already demonstrated a lot of tendencies toward addiction, which is a concern. And definitely that he has no qualms about lying to us if it means he's getting what he wants. And that's probably the main thing that is getting in the way of him getting what he wants. So all of these elements come together to affect the purpose and the techniques the writer or speaker will use to achieve that purpose. The purpose is what the writer or speaker wants the audience to think, feel, do, or understand as a result of reading or hearing the text. So in this case, of course, the purpose, my son's purpose, is to convince us to buy him a phone next year. That's what he wants us to do. But it's going to take a lot for him to be able to convince us. And so any decision that he would make, for him to be effective, he really needs to think about what is going to motivate us. It's not enough for him to promise us, oh, I will be good about it. I promise I will limit my time, because he's already shown that he can't do that. And so what we've told him he needs to do is demonstrate understanding of our values by showing maturity, by setting his own limits and following them and not breaking the rules and not lying. Kind of straightforward things that might seem obvious to us now is older, wiser people, but he's 9. And so we need to be a little bit understanding of that. But what he needs to understand to be successful in this is that he's not going to convince us by telling us what he wants. The argument that all my friends have one is not convincing to us because that's not our value, that's his value. If he is going to convince us, he needs to tap into our values. And so whenever I say, your text is not about you, it's about your audience, I want you to remember that. I want you to remember my son's argument for his phone and how he can tell us up and down every day, all my friends have one. And I'm going to say, I don't care, because that's not what I value. That's what he values. So your argument, your text should not be direct, should not be about you and what you value. That might be the starting point and the genesis of it. But ultimately, in terms of what you create, what you write, it has to be about your audience. You have to create that whole piece for your audience if you really want to be effective. And you're going to hear me say that quite a bit for the rest of the year.